This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Hello, I'm Rithala Shah. Thank you for downloading the World Tonight podcast on Tuesday the 24th of September. On the programme, 11 of the country's most senior judges have unanimously ruled that Boris Johnson's decision to prorogue Parliament was unlawful. The Supreme Court President, Lady Hale, said the effect on the fundamentals of democracy was extreme. We'll be considering the immediate impact of that ruling on Parliament and Brexit. Should there be resignations from the government? And we'll discuss the longer-term constitutional implications of today's decision. Will the relationship between the Queen and the Prime Minister ever be the same again? And is it now more likely we may move to a written constitution? Exaggerate and then simplify. It's a critical description of journalism, but it is difficult to exaggerate the enormity of the ruling delivered by the Supreme Court this morning. And simplify? Well, it's likely lawyers and historians will pore over it for years to come. This isn't a ruling that'll apply just to Brexit. It'll remain in place from today onwards. 11 Supreme Court justices unanimously ruled that Boris Johnson's advice to the Queen that Parliament should be suspended or prorogued for 5 weeks was unlawful. Firstly, the Supreme Court President, Lady Hale, addressed the question of whether the court could rule on Boris Johnson's decision. Is it justiciable?
This judgment is the unanimous judgment of all 11 justices. The first question is whether the lawfulness of the Prime Minister's advice to Her Majesty is justiciable. This court holds that it is. The courts have exercised a supervisory jurisdiction over the lawfulness of acts of the government for centuries. As long ago as 1611, the court held that, quote, the King, who was then the government, hath no prerogative but that which the law of the land allows him. End quote.
And she went on to explain why Boris Johnson's decision was unlawful.
The court is bound to conclude, therefore, that the decision to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament was unlawful because it had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification.
And Lady Hale said the court's unanimous decision meant Parliament had effectively not been prorogued. The decision was null and of no effect. Boris Johnson was in New York, where he was due to address the UN General Assembly. He gave his reaction to the Supreme Court ruling and was undeterred from continuing with his agenda.
This is a verdict that we will respect, and we respect the judicial process. I have to say I strongly disagree with what the justices have found. I don't think that it's right, but we will go ahead and, of course, Parliament will come back. I do think there's a good case for getting on with a Queen's speech anyway, and we'll do that. But I think the most important thing is we get on and deliver Brexit on October the 31st.
We have been bidding for a government minister to come on and explain what may happen next, but no one is available. We have, though, been speaking to Lord Young, George Young, who resigned from his job as a government whip last month in protest at that decision to prorogue Parliament. A short time ago, he told me what he thought Boris Johnson needs to do now.
Well, I think the government now needs to do a number of things. First of all, it needs to reset its relationship with Parliament, which has clearly been bruised over this recent prorogation, which a lot of people in Parliament felt was inappropriate. And I think that if you're to reset that relationship, I think the Leader of the House of Commons has to fall on his sword as someone who should never have agreed to Parliament being treated in that way by the government.
So you think Jacob Rees-Mogg should resign?
I think the Leader of the House of Commons should never have agreed to prorogation for 5 weeks. The Leader of the House of Commons is slightly different from other members of the Cabinet. He's the voice of the Cabinet in the House of Commons, but he's also the voice of the House of Commons in the Cabinet. And in that position, I don't think he should have given his approval to bypassing Parliament in the way that has happened. Then I think the Prime Minister also needs to reach out to the people who have been expelled from the party. I think he should restore the whip to those who have lost it. I think he should try to bring back into the government some of those who left in July or have been dismissed since then. And I think he should stop talking about leaving do or die by October the 31st with or without a deal, because clearly that would just precipitate another confrontation with Parliament and the courts if he tried to break the law. And then finally, what he's got to do to solve this is to get a deal and then present it to Parliament and hopefully get it through and then leave with a deal. That is what he should do. Rebuild his relationships and get a deal.
You talk about the need for Jacob Rees-Mogg as Leader of the House to resign, but what about the Prime Minister himself?
Well, I don't think we want another leadership election in the Conservative Party with the deadline of October the 31st. I think that the Attorney-General should probably consider his position, possibly the Lord Chancellor, whoever gave the advice.
The Attorney-General, I think,
lawful.
issued a statement earlier today saying the government acted in good faith and what they believe was lawful and constitutional.
Yes. I don't think it's good enough to go around blaming Dominic Cummings. I think this was a fairly major sort of car crash for the government, and for nobody to take responsibility at all, I think would be wrong. And I think Jacob Rees-Mogg is an honourable man, and I think he would accept his part in the fiasco that we've just seen.
So just to be clear, you're saying that you'd want to see Geoffrey Cox go as well?
I think he should look at his position as the legal advisor. Clearly, what we have just seen is a constitutional crisis of fairly major proportions. And for simply everyone in the government to carry on as if nothing had happened, I think would be wrong. Somebody should take responsibility for what has happened over the past 5 or 6 weeks.
Do you think that, given everything that has happened, that Parliament can now come back and act with some sort of unity? There only ever seems to be agreement about what people don't agree on as opposed to what they do agree on.
I think there is a good chance of Parliament passing something like the deal that Theresa May negotiated earlier this year. Clearly, there will have to be some adjustments to the backstop, but I think there's a good chance of Parliament living up to its responsibilities, and perhaps with not everybody in the government supporting it, and perhaps not everybody in the opposition parties supporting it. But I think there would be a majority of people in Parliament who recognise the country is fed up with this. This is the best deal that we're going to get. And the right thing to do is to vote for the best deal, move into the transitional period, and then simply move on.
So is a deal really that Boris Johnson's best chance of surviving, only chance of surviving as Prime Minister?
He seems to have blocked off all the alternatives in that he said he's not going to ask for an extension. So if we haven't got a deal by the end of October, he's either going to break the law or he's going to resign. The sensible alternative is actually to focus on the deal, get it through Parliament, and then move on. And I think he'd then be in quite a good position within the few months thereafter to call an election.
The Prime Minister earlier today said that he profoundly disagreed with the ruling, but he would respect it.
Yes.
Do you think that's the sign of a man who's showing any contrition or any willingness to compromise?
I think just a little bit of humility would have been more appropriate. He lost. Because I think the right thing would be to say that he respects the judgment rather than to grumble about it and think that the Supreme Court made a mistake, which is what Number 10 seemed to be briefing. And I think just a little bit of humility rather than defiance.
And do you think there's an apology? Do you think there's an apology necessary for the Queen?
I think an apology for what has been a serious misjudgment by the government, yes.
To the Queen?
Amongst others, yes.
The Conservative peer, Lord Young. And he was also calling there for Jacob Rees-Mogg to resign. Well, it's being reported tonight that Jacob Rees-Mogg told Cabinet colleagues in a conference call earlier this evening that the Supreme Court decision amounted to a constitutional coup. The simplest way of understanding today's decision is that MPs are once again back in the driving seat. The Speaker, John Bercow, has said Parliament will sit at 11:30 tomorrow morning, and Mr Rees-Mogg will speak for the government when MPs reconvene. The Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, brought forward his address to the Labour Party conference to this afternoon so he could be back in Westminster for tomorrow's sitting. Speaking in Brighton, he called on the Prime Minister to resign, but said he wouldn't press for a general election until he was sure there wouldn't be a no-deal Brexit.
The democracy that Boris Johnson describes as a rigmarole will not be stifled, and the people will have their say. Tomorrow, Parliament will return.
Well, one MP who's already returned and didn't hang about in Brighton to hear the leader's speech is Labour's Luke Pollard. His office, along with plenty of other MPs, is in Portcullis House in Westminster. I went down there this afternoon. It's a space where normally you'll see lots of MPs hanging around having cups of tea and coffee. Bit of plotting goes on here, I think it's fair to say. It's pretty quiet today. There's a handful of people, more security people actually than anybody else. But Luke Pollard is here. Hello, Luke.
Hello, how are you doing?
Thank you very much for having us. You're here, you're back.
I am, yes. Well, I came up from Brighton, from Labour conference, because being in Westminster is where I should be in the middle of a national crisis.
You didn't even hang about for Jeremy Corbyn's speech?
So I watched it on TV. He did a great job with it, actually, but one of the joys of being an MP is that you get to see Jeremy quite a lot. And so, in my mind, conferences for members to have a seat in the kind of conference hall, not for MPs to take all the limelight.
Well, should we get up to your office now? There's loads of things I want to ask you.
Let's do it.
You're back. And I saw the picture of you on Twitter sitting on the green benches. What are you going to do?
I suspect tomorrow, one thing the government will try and do is introduce a recess motion to try and, within the rules, shut Parliament down so the Conservatives can have their party jamboree next week. But I don't think MPs are going to go for that. I think we will require Parliament to carry on sitting. We've got to be asking difficult questions of Boris Johnson about what advice was he given to prorogue Parliament? What did he say to the Queen? Because it looks like he lied to her, and we need to understand that conversation much more. What is his plans now that Parliament's prorogation is unlawful? What's he going to be doing? Because we've got enough bills to be going on. The domestic violence bill, the fisheries bill, the agriculture bill.
There's lots going on, but the biggest thing that's going on is the deadline, the October the 31st deadline for Brexit. The situation is as it was before Parliament was prorogued. Everybody's divided. So isn't it likely that Boris Johnson will call for a general election? Then what do you do?
Well, Boris will continue to call for a general election, I think. But that's a trap we're not going to fall into, because we need to make sure that no deal is off the table before a general election happens. Because as soon as we vote for a general election, the timing of it is in the hands of the Prime Minister. And as we've seen from the Supreme Court judgment today, he can't be trusted with it.
But hang on a minute. You just said to me that you're going to ask all these difficult questions of the Prime Minister. If you don't like the answers, then what's the action you can take? A vote of no confidence? A general election? I don't understand. How are you going to how is Parliament, which appears to have been given the power by the Supreme Court, how is Parliament going to use that power?
Well, I suspect a vote of no confidence is not far away. And also a general election will be called soon. So in my mind, we've got to have a referendum. We've got to put the deal on whichever deal that Boris Johnson's going to come back with, put it to the people, test whether that's what they want. I think people will have a different view than they had in 2016.
But as things stand, Boris Johnson insists that he's not going to go for an extension of the Brexit deadline. So you're in a situation where you might call a vote of no confidence. What then? Who would run a unity government? Who would head a unity government?
Well, if Boris Johnson decides to ignore the law that Parliament has passed
He might not ignore the law, he might find a way around the law.
I don't think there is a way around the law. It's pretty tight to say you either come back with a deal that Parliament votes for, you either come back with no deal that Parliament votes for, or you extend Article 50 until the end of January. That's what the law says on this one here. Now, he's already been found to have presided over an unlawful prorogation of Parliament. Will he risk that again with denying to fail to comply with the law that we've got here? I don't think he will. And I think more and more Tories are starting to understand that actually a public vote is an option to resolve this, because we are stuck in a quagmire here. There is no easy options ahead of us.
That's the Labour MP Luke Pollard talking to me in his parliamentary office earlier. Well, there's no doubt Boris Johnson will fly back into a storm of condemnation when Parliament's reconvened tomorrow, and there are several politicians calling for him to resign. The Liberal Democrat leader, Jo Swinson, said the ruling showed Mr Johnson was unfit to be Prime Minister, as he was prepared to mislead the Queen and the whole country. Well, on the line now from New York is the BBC's Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, who's been travelling with the Prime Minister. John, what's the mood like, would you say, in the PM's camp?
Well, they look as if they're in a tight political corner. And if nothing else, the events of today have shown the Prime Minister is in the tightest of political corners, and we see that picture now more vividly than even before. You only really had to see what Boris Johnson said to me when I was putting it to him, how did he mean to react to this court ruling here in New York shortly after the ruling came down? And what he said was, among other things, that he wanted to get on with a Queen's speech, to get on with the agenda. Of course, the problem with that is a Queen's speech marks a new parliamentary session. You can't do that until the old one's over, and you have to prorogue. And now, of course, the prorogation has been rubbed out, as it were, and it looks from the argument put forward by the judges that another prorogation, a second prorogation, could be judged in exactly the same way. He also told me, he told a lot of other people, that he wanted to get the country out by the 31st of October. He said that was the law as it stood. But of course, that's not, Rituala, the law as it stands. And there's now a new law in place, which means that the Prime Minister cannot take Britain out of the European Union with no deal on October the 31st unless Parliament consents. And Parliament clearly will not consent to that. So the corner is very tight. And as you were discussing just a moment ago, the search for a deal, if a deal is at all to be found, now becomes more urgent, a political imperative.
And just briefly then, is there any likelihood then, is there any optimism that he could get that deal past Parliament?
Well, at the moment, he has to get a deal with the European Union first before he can put it to Parliament. And at the moment, the two sides of the negotiating table are still some way apart. The European Union looking to protect their single market, Britain looking to protect its freedom to divert from EU rules. If that can be squared, then it can, of course, be put before Parliament. But that box isn't close to being ticked, and time is ticking away. There's a summit on October the 17th, and then 2 days after that, something has to be done. And otherwise, it's an extension. Otherwise, he's in breach of the law.
John Pienaar, thank you very much, and we'll hear from Brussels in a few minutes. Well, Scotland's highest court had already ruled that the decision to prorogue Parliament was unlawful, a finding the Supreme Court today upheld. But Scotland was crucial to this case in another way. In reaching their decision, the Supreme Court judges cited a piece of 17th century Scottish law, the Claim of Right, which they argue insists that Parliament be allowed to sit. Scotland, of course, voted Remain in the original EU referendum. So how has today's Supreme Court result gone down there? The World Tonight's Paul Moss reports from Edinburgh.
You couldn't miss the smiles. Sitting in a corner of an Edinburgh cafe, a group of Scottish Remain campaigners were digesting the Supreme Court verdict. A victory for the rule of law, they thought, a defeat for Boris Johnson. But the decision was also, Ken Robertson told me, a victory for the judges in Scotland's highest court, because it was their original decision which had been upheld.
The Scottish jurisdiction, in a sense, led the way on this. And I think it puts PM Johnson in a pretty awkward spot. I think he's been revealed to be as guilty of political knavery as he was at the time of the referendum.
Stuart, your reaction to today's decision?
Oh, I'm overwhelmed. I think it shows that Scotland has a thriving, independent judiciary. I think particularly our present Prime Minister, Johnson, seems to have almost discarded Scotland. We have our own courts, which has been showing up today.
Now, John Edward, you campaigned ardently for Remain in the European Union referendum. How are you feeling at today's decision?
It makes me feel pleased that people in the United Kingdom have been reminded what United Kingdom means. In Scotland, there is a separate legal system that could have a different impact, and it's important when people are talking about parliamentary sovereignty and the role of the judiciary that they get a voice in these matters.
If you look here, there seems to be an important distinction between the English Bill of Rights and the Scottish Claim of Right.
I found Stephen Tierney poring over the details behind today's Supreme Court decision. A professor of constitutional theory at Edinburgh Law School, Tierney admits he was rather taken by surprise at the result, not expecting such a strident enunciation of Boris Johnson's decision to prorogue Parliament. But Professor Tierney was also surprised that the judges cited Scottish law in explaining their decision.
The Supreme Court judgment today quotes this passage: Parliaments ought to be frequently called and allowed to sit. And that is from the Claim of Right, a fairly obscure Scottish constitutional document from over 300 years ago.
So they're basing their judgment in part on Scottish law as opposed to what might be termed English and Welsh law?
What the judgment in the Supreme Court says is that prorogation is unlawful because Parliament should be able to sit and make important decisions. To get to that conclusion, they're citing this obscure Scottish provision, and it seems to be central to their decision.
Today we have heard the ruling from the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. The prorogation of Parliament.
They were already supposed to be debating Brexit at the Scottish Parliament today, the economic and political fallout. But the Supreme Court decision certainly added an extra frisson to proceedings. Scotland's First Minister, the Scottish National Party leader Nicola Sturgeon, was among the many queuing up to call for Boris Johnson to resign. The SNP's deputy leader Keith Brown told me the result proved even more the case for full Scottish independence.
Well, I think you have to see this as the latest in quite a line of different things which I feel like pull the veils back. The UK is not fit for purpose. It's not the beacon of democracy. So I think these things are tearing away the kind of credibility of the UK constitution, such as it is, and are strengthening the case for independence for Scotland.
But you could say today is a great day for the Union because Scottish law has been shown to play an equal and as important role in a Supreme Court decision as English and Welsh law.
I've already said I welcome the decision that's been taken, but let's look at the background, the contempt that was shown by Downing Street for the decision of the Scottish judges previously. Downing Street sources immediately, once the decision was made clear, starting to impugn the integrity of the Scottish judges. It's about other Scottish judges. They're politically biased, they're easier to influence. That is what is hastening the move towards independence for people that perhaps previously were not convinced.
Well, wandering around the corridors of power here at the Scottish Parliament is the veteran observer of Scottish politics, Alex Massey, a columnist for The Times. Alex Massey, the Scottish National Party have called for Boris Johnson to resign. That perhaps would be expected, but the fact is he's not exactly a popular figure with everyone up here, even the Scottish Conservatives. The Scottish Conservative leader until recently, Ruth Davidson, famously publicly disagreed with Boris Johnson. How do you think his position here in Scotland has been affected by what's happened today?
Well, it hasn't been improved. You're absolutely right to say that, Boris Johnson's problem in Scotland is not just that he is unpopular with the people you would expect to dislike him. You have more than half the Tory supporters in Scotland who essentially say that they don't believe that the Prime Minister is a trustworthy individual. Today's Supreme Court decision, I think, merely reinforces the sense that, the government and Boris Johnson in particular is in a deep hole. Now, that's true across the UK, but it's even deeper here in Scotland. And if he was looking for a ladder to climb out of this hole and so on, well, actually, I think the Supreme Court sent him a shovel instead.
The bar was an upbeat one. The customer I'd come to meet certainly wasn't. You might have described Ian Morse as sobbing into his beer. But in fact, it was coffee Mr. Morse was sipping on, and truth is, he wasn't quite crying either. But as a long-standing campaigner for Brexit, as someone who hopes to stand as a candidate for the Brexit Party in Edinburgh, today's Supreme Court result clearly seemed to come as a setback.
My concern is that the people who voted for Brexit, who were in a majority, will start to get angrier and angrier about this and will want to exact a price, because I think the Remainers are so determined to frustrate this process. Today's result may well be part of that. Only history will tell. We'll only know in 5 years from now. A lot of people will feel cheated.
That's Ian Moore sending that report from Paul Moss in Edinburgh. Well, let's move away from Brexit for a moment, because it's not just Boris Johnson who's facing difficulties of a legal nature. Just as we came on air, in the United States, Nancy Pelosi, the Democrat Speaker of the House of Representatives, announced formal impeachment proceedings against President Trump. This is what she had to say.
This week, the president has admitted to asking the president of Ukraine to take actions which would benefit him politically. The actions of the Trump presidency revealed the dishonorable fact of the president's betrayal of his oath of office, betrayal of our national security, and betrayal of the integrity of our elections. Therefore, today, I'm announcing the House of Representatives moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry.
Our Washington correspondent Gary O'Donoghue's on the line. Gary, remind us of the background to this story. What's the president being accused of?
Well, he's been being accused of a breach of his constitutional responsibilities. Don't forget, if you're going to bring articles of impeachment, they have to amount to treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. They have to meet that barrier, and the Democrats believe that this latest instance, they believe, involving the Ukrainians and Donald Trump trying to put pressure on them to investigate Joe Biden, his main rival for the presidency next year as things stand in the Democratic race. They believe that will qualify for that. So she's pressed the congressional nuclear button. She's been under a lot of pressure to do that from her members for months and months and months. And this week we reached the tipping point.
But why this week? As you say, there have been plenty of previous calls to impeach Donald Trump. Nancy Pelosi's resisted them all so far.
A few serious things have changed this week. Number one, a bunch of moderate Democrats in the House from Republican-leaning districts finally decided they would support impeachment. That was a big barrier to her before this. They worried about losing their seats. It wasn't just the sort of progressive ones on the left who are jumping up and down from the beginning. Some of the moderates have moved. Number two, Nancy Pelosi said today she believed this case was a very simple one and a very easy one for the American public to understand, unlike the kind of months and months of protracted ins and outs of the Russia investigation. So she's become persuaded, I think, that this is the case they can use if they're going to go for it.
And very briefly, is there a risk here, though, for the Democrats?
Of course there is. There's a huge political risk. You remember what happened when Bill Clinton was impeached back in the 90s? He got a bounce off it. They are very unlikely to get a conviction in the Senate because that requires 2/3 of people voting there. That would mean 20 Republicans changing side. The calculation is, in the run-up to an election, this will do sufficient damage, getting this dirty laundry, if you will, out in public, being investigated, that on balance will damage the president going into an election year.
Gary O'Donoghue, thanks very much. Well, let's return now to tonight's main story over here, and that ruling by the Supreme Court. Let's head to Brussels, where no doubt the events have been viewed with interest. Our Europe editor, Katya Adler, is on the line. Katya, what are people making of all of this over there?
Well, I mean, off the record, I've had diplomats say to me this is embarrassing or humiliating in their opinion for the Prime Minister. But officially, the EU sees this as a domestic matter, so we haven't heard from Emmanuel Macron, Angela Merkel. The European Commission absolutely refused to comment, despite being really prodded and poked by journalists today. And actually, as far as Brexit talks are concerned, it doesn't really change all that much on the ground, because under EU law, the EU's negotiating partner is Her Majesty's government, which is still headed by Boris Johnson, and EU leaders still want a Brexit deal as soon as they can possibly get it. You have low-level technical EU-UK talks on a revised Brexit deal continuing tomorrow, but this has also not changed. The EU's chief Brexit negotiator is still shouting from the rooftops, really, today in Berlin, Michel Barnier, that the UK ideas so far that he's seen on how to replace the Irish border backstop, he says, are inadequate. So, you know, one diplomat from an EU country traditionally very close to the UK said to me today, look, it was already looking pretty difficult to get a new Brexit deal together for next month. This ruling in the UK, the domestic twists and turns, makes things even more complicated. And of course, the clock is ticking, as the EU likes to say, until that October Brexit deadline.
Katya Adler, thank you very much. We learned tonight that Boris Johnson rang the Queen from New York. A senior government official said the discussion had taken place after the verdict. And remember, of course, that verdict found that his advice to the Queen that Parliament should be prorogued for 5 weeks in the run-up to Brexit was unlawful. But the official wouldn't comment on whether Boris Johnson had apologised to the Queen. So should he apologise? Kate Williams is a royal historian and professor of history at the University of Reading. Good evening.
Good evening.
Kate Williams, do you think he should have apologised?
Well, yes, I do. I think that simply the Supreme Court said very clearly that the advice given to the Queen was unlawful, not mistaken, not slightly misguided. It was unlawful and therefore involved the Queen in what was an unlawful act. And it seems very clear that the Supreme Court is saying the government gave no evidence behind what they wanted to do, and therefore there was no evidence, and really saying that they involved the Queen in what they dragged her into, a neutral monarch, into this constitutional disaster. Really, I mean, it's a constitutional catastrophe for Boris Johnson, but also in general, he put a bomb under the Constitution. Really.
Well, do you think then that relationship between the Queen, the head of state, and the Prime Minister has been changed for good?
I think there is a change, and I think the relationship, the whole point of the monarchy, the neutral monarchy, the idea is that politics goes on the same whether the Queen is there or not, when we argue about whether or not the monarchy should exist. And obviously the Queen is really a constitutional rubber stamp, and the Prime Minister, the whole point is that he or she goes to her with a decision that has the majority view of Parliament behind him. Whether or not the Queen agrees with it, she still stamps it through. But we have a situation here where the Prime Minister went to the Queen wanting something to prorogue that the Parliament did not want, and gave her this illegal advice, unlawful advice. And therefore, I think there are 2 points for this going forward, is that the whole relationship relies on the Queen being given lawful, correct advice by the Prime Minister. This wasn't what happened, so therefore she can question in the future, is this lawful? Is this going to involve me in an unlawful act? She and the other monarchs to follow. And also, what this has proved, I mean, today was a battle for sovereignty between Prime Minister and Parliament. Who's sovereign, Prime Minister or Parliament? And the Supreme Court said Parliament. So in the future, if the monarch is ever asked to choose between what the Prime Minister wants and what Parliament wants, the monarch really, according to this president, has to choose Parliament.
And just briefly then, Buckingham Palace has kept Sturm today, but how do you think they might be feeling?
I don't expect to hear any comment from them. They will keep stum about this, but we probably will comment from royal sources. They weren't happy about this initially. They weren't happy about really being swept up into this constitutional disaster, really. Mr. Johnson using the technicalities of Parliament to try and really shut it up. The household and the royal household and the courtiers were not happy about this. And this, of course, is very concerning and very worrying for them. The Queen has been a neutral monarch for all these years and is now in the final years of her reign. She's being dragged into this sort of constitutional disaster. Okay. So he'll expect a bit of a dressing down to come.
Professor Kate Williams, thank you very much. Lady Hale spoke clearly and in language which was relatively easy to understand, and yet she delivered a message, a ruling, which may have far-reaching consequences for our unwritten constitution. Well, 2 people who know a thing or two about the conventions and statutes which are the building blocks of the constitution are Vernon Bogdanor, a research professor at the Centre for British Politics and Government at King's College London, and Timothy Endicott, who's Professor of Legal Philosophy at the University of Oxford. Good evening to you both.
Good evening.
Vernon Bogdanor, first of all, I wonder if you'd like to comment on the point that Kate Williams was making there, but this idea that the Queen, this may change permanently the relationship between the head of state and the Prime Minister.
I don't think it will. It's worth remembering that, of course, Boris Johnson did not intend to give advice which was unlawful, and indeed in a lower court, the Lord Chief Justice and the Master of the Rolls indicated that his advice was lawful. So it was a very complex case which has come out against the Prime Minister. And no doubt he has apologised to the Queen. But of course the Queen acts on the advice of the Prime Minister. It's not her job to ask whether the advice is lawful. That's a matter for the courts. And if she acts on the advice of her Prime Minister, she remains above the political battle as head of state and head of the nation.
Timothy Endicott, then, more broadly, how significant is today's ruling?
It's a dramatically unprecedented ruling, and it's quite striking what the judges have done with a long tradition of judicial control of the government. I do agree that it's easy to understand until you get to the arcane legal stuff about the remedy at the end, and I hope your listeners will read it if they didn't hear Baroness Hale. Here's how it works in a nutshell. The courts protect Parliament's sovereignty. They do so by giving supreme effect to acts of Parliament. But that supreme effect of acts of Parliament is no good if Parliament can't meet. So the court must protect Parliament's capacity to meet. And so the rule that comes out of this case is that it's unlawful to use the prerogative power to timetable sessions of Parliament in a way that has the effect of preventing Parliament from carrying out its constitutional function without a reasonable justification. Now, here's the thing that's new about all this. It has never been the job of the courts until today to regulate Parliament by supervising the executive's decisions about timetabling. That's new. And of course, there's this great germ of truth in the judgment that Parliament's sovereign lawmaking power is useless if it can't meet. But the constitutionally important need, our need as a country for Parliament to meet, has always been attained in the past, ever since Parliament became ascendant over the King, through politics, through the operation of the government itself, through cabinet government since the 19th century, through the operation of the political parties, and through the House of Commons.
Vernon Bogdanor, is that where you see the shift?
Well, indeed. I think we'd all agree that if the government had proposed prorogation for 6 months, it would have been right for the courts to intervene. But clearly, if the prorogation was for 1 or 2 days, that would be obviously acceptable. And this was in perhaps the middle ground, the marginal area. There have, as was acknowledged in the proceedings, been longer prorogations in the past. It's a difficult matter of judgment as to whether this particular prorogation was unlawful or not. And it is, after all, slightly odd that Parliament will be meeting, as I understand it, tomorrow, because it's not met during the conference recess in living memory. So it's a difficult decision to have made, and of course the decision of the Supreme Court is final.
So do you think a precedent has been set here where there will be much more legal challenge applied to controversial decisions taken by the executive?
Well, they say in the first paragraph that it's a one-off. Let's hope. What we're dealing with is a political crisis in which the House of Commons is divided and is against the government every which way and voted against them in 5 out of 5 votes earlier this month, and yet won't throw them out. And you might say,
yes.
Why on earth are they not throwing them out if the Prime Minister has prevented Parliament from carrying out its function without reasonable justification? So let's hope for the day when the House of Commons is doing its job and the political parties are forming a policy that gets them a majority in the House of Commons. And then this will be a one-off. But meanwhile, and even in whatever the conditions are in the future, government lawyers are going to be looking at the inter-office emails in the Prime Minister's office when they're preparing to bring one session to an end and start a new session. And there are other steps that are subject to judicial review now under this decision. If the Fixed Term Parliament Act were repealed and the Prime Minister got back the power to dissolve, then it would be very easy to argue that would be subject to judicial review.
Vernon Bogdanor, many people have pointed to the way in which the Fixed Term Parliament Act has changed the way that the balance of powers within Parliament. But just briefly then, is there a stronger case tonight for a written constitution or elements of a written constitution?
There is a case for a written constitution, but I think it wouldn't have affected this particular situation. And the nub of it, as Timothy Endicott has said, is that Parliament does not support the government's Brexit strategy, but will not remove the government through a vote of no confidence, and will not allow the government to call a general election. That is a consequence of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, and it's the reason for the deadlock, the political deadlock, that we are now suffering from.
So essentially, I think what both of you are saying is get rid of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, or at least amend it in some way.
Absolutely. In my view, a majority in Parliament should be able to call an election, and a vote of confidence should be able to be attached to specific legislation, which it could be before the Fixed Term Parliament Act.
Vernon Bogdanor and Timothy Endicott, thank you both very much indeed. Tonight's main headline, the Queen has spoken to Boris Johnson following the Supreme Court ruling that his suspension of Parliament in the run-up to Brexit was unlawful. The Prime Minister, who's facing calls to resign, has said he strongly disagrees with the judgment, but will respect it. The former Conservative Cabinet Minister, Lord Young, told us Mr Johnson needed to show some humility rather than defiance and called for the Leader of the House, Jacob Rees-Mogg, to resign. That's The World Tonight. Good evening.